So, what are we all here for? Discussion on the concept of a product operating system based on a recent blog by John. And so I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to John. What we're going to do, this is an Ask Me Anything session. So if you have a question for, let me stop sharing first. If you have a question for John, it's a small group, so just raise your hand. If you're not comfortable, he'll call on you and come off the microphone. If you're not comfortable with that, go ahead and put it in chat, and Andrew and I will take care of curating that for John. So either way works, either in the chat or just raise your hand. And I think we're going to kick it off. And I think I'm going to start with the first question just to kick things off, John.
Yep, happy to. Yeah.
So what are just lost my train of thought. What are some of the, I guess, if you will, misconceptions? What are the biggest misconceptions about what a quote unquote product operating system actually is? And how do you clarify those misunderstandings for people who are new to this concept?
Yeah, so the inspiration for this particular post in the product community in the last year or so, there was a book published by someone named Marty Kagan, and he published this book called Transformed. And in that book, he talked about something called the product operating model. He used the word model at that point. And the book is basically a collection of principles or observations that if you took, 100 companies that are could be generally regarded as effective at building profitable, successful, growing, usable, delightful products, you would find a certain set of principles. And remember, like, principles books are everywhere too. So this is not just his book. We all read these principles books. The basic idea of a principles book is you take a lot of people, you decide what's in common to them, and then you write a book about it. And then you say, here are the principles to do it. And so in that book, you get things like, well, you're going to fund your teams for long-term success, or you're going to do these things. And an observation based on my work and is that, principles are just principles. In fact, there's a vast spectrum of ways that companies manifest those particular principles. And I'll give you an example. I've worked at companies that dutifully prepared product requirements documents with problem statements and metrics and interview notes, and then you sort of describe directionally potential solutions as this 8-page document or 6-page document. I've written them in 1 page, 6 pages, 8 pages, 12 pages, depending on the company. Great. And I've also worked at companies where we never did anything like that. You just wouldn't do that. You would actually have a conversation with people and maybe take some notes, and you do these things. So the principle is there, the principle of kind of framing your bet, framing the opportunity, maybe framing what valuable it might bring to the company, framing the risks. Like, the principles are there. But how a company manifested those principles could be vastly different across companies. So going back to this particular book, it was pretty popular. And, I started to receive a lot of requests like, we want to do the product operating model. We want to do that. That's what we want to do. And this is, I'm back to working full time. I head up product at a place called .work, which is I'll talk about that in a little bit because it's germane to this. So I started getting all these requests, and I thought to myself, like, this is kind of a funny question. You read a book about a set of principles, and now you're asking how to do it. Like, but that's the thing you want to do. You want to do this product operating model thing. And you might actually connect this to some things around Scrum or Agile. This is probably the same set of problems that we have with other things that we do. And I would start to talk to those companies like, well, what's your culture like? Like, are you a writing friendly culture? Or are you not a writing friendly culture? Are you an async meeting culture? Or are you not an async meeting culture? Do your founders have any experience doing this? Have they shipped anything ever? And where did they ship anything? Um, are you a more communitarian culture? Or are you more individualistic culture? Do you believe that people should go off and do their own things and be highly individual accountability? Or do you think it should be a lot of group accountability? So I would go and start asking these questions. And they would say, well, that's interesting. Why are you asking these questions? I mean, we just need to adopt the product operating model. Like, we need to adopt the product operating model. What are you talking about? And I would tell them from my own experience. I'd say, well, I worked at companies where we would do, I literally, and you'll see me jump into funny pictures if it helps, because I have a lot of things that I've written over the years. But I presented at Agile 2015. This is wow, it's 10 years ago. Wow, okay, time flies. And I remember, I presented and I showed this picture about me as a UX researcher taking our team out of the building in a van and staying in a hotel or motel in another part of California for 2 weeks. No hands-on keyboards in 2 weeks. Those are developers. This is a customer. This is us co-designing and thinking with the customer. No typing, no stories, no tickets, nothing. This is how we would operate, right? To do these particular things. Okay, and great. That's a fun way to work. Now, if you went to another company and you suggested that, it would be the end of the world. I mean, that would literally be anathema. You would never possibly, and not just because people don't feel like it, because potentially you might have a multi-millionaire founder who made their living by hands-on keyboards and telling other people to go off and do that research, right? To do those things. So anyway, a lot of this I worked at a company called Amplitude where I met with like hundreds and almost thousands of teams around the world. And you begin to understand these cultural differences, hence me asking these particular questions. So roundabout story, this might have provoked some questions or ideas for people. I started to think, and I call it a product operating system, but we just think about an operating system. I thought that maybe there is this idea of, okay, either you're intentional or explicit about it, or maybe you're totally implicit about it and not intentional about it. Someone has designed the game in your company. Someone has designed the operating system. Someone has designed whether they were intentional about setting those norms or not. A leader decided that they're going to begin every AMA talking about the revenue you earned in the last quarter and the stuff you shipped so that customers would buy your product. Another founder is going to talk about the 3-year goal every single meeting to keep people on focus. Like, someone designed that, whether they were intentional or not. Someone has made all these particular decisions. And to show you what I mean, this is, now it's a little bit about my work. Like, the product that I'm working on it doesn't necessarily require people to document what they're doing, but by setting the tool up, you basically can have an implied operating system. Anyway, so this is an example of a table of contents from one of our customers. And when you look at this, you're like, oh my God, this is a designed thing. There's the purpose, there's mission, there's vision, there's operating principles, there's strategic foundations, there's an organizational architecture, there's a communication framework, there's cadences, there's rituals, there's policies, there's protocols, there's documents, there's a glossary, there's core workflows, there's how are we going to manage our knowledge, how are we going to measure things, how are we going to onboard people. Now, the funny thing is, and they fleshed out all the details here. It's way too long. I was pasting into this document last minute before to do these things. Now, there are companies that if you walked in and you said you wanted to write that document, you'd be shown the door immediately. Like, we don't write stuff like that. Writing it will steal the soul of any of that. We don't write things like that. We just act like that. And that's the culture, and we don't do it. You walk into other companies where they actually pride themselves on that document. GitLab, for example, prides itself on literally having a very explicit culture. The point being, though, it's all there, no matter whether you've been intentional about it or not intentional, or written it down or not written it down. And so that's kind of the thing. That's what inspired this particular post. I wrote a couple of here's some design principles as when you start thinking about setting this up in the company. But I'm curious if anyone has any questions or this provoked any ideas for people. And what we're really talking about here is the sort of explicit versus implied. I'm going to call it operating system, for lack of better words. We could talk about WOW, ways of working. Some people talk about that. There's other words for this. But yeah, in the environments that you've observed, how did this design thing come to be? Who designed it? What skills did they have? Are they a systems thinker? Are they a process thinker? Are they a vibes thinker? Are they just a naturalistic leader who just tells other people to just figure it out? Like, how did the thing come to be in environments that you've been in? And so I'll pause for a second to see if this inspired any ideas from folks. But this is how we sort of came to this topic. And I forgot which of the coffee mugs on my desk have the have the new coffee. Yeah, Maha. I think this is it.
Hey, nice to meet you, John.
Yeah, nice to meet you too.
I actually follow your blog because I've been through the sort of process of joining a lot of companies in the United States where they think they're agile. I start kind of drawing up the systems, drawing up the workflows, trying to understand which, for example, how to fit the shoe into the right foot in terms of a
Yeah.
lot of the policies and procedures. And one of the things I've actually faced is I was actually shown the door
Yeah.
in at least one of these situations where I started discussing a lot of these things. I started discussing the importance of trying to actually match and focus on how the workflow within the organization, for example, does not necessarily match up with how you need to
Right.
be in agile. And that's actually the bottleneck. The bottleneck is
Yeah.
not agility itself. Agile is not dead. Agile is not failing, but you kind of put in on top. Basically, what I've been talking to them about is that there's the infrastructure, the cultural infrastructure. On top of the cultural infrastructure, you put a new system in place,
Yeah.
but you're still the old machinery. But I've always had a very hard time, and I don't know if it's because I'm just like more junior or anything else like that. I've always had a hard time communicating the value. I've always had a hard time communicating, for example, the impact that I might actually have in terms of not just shifting into agile, shifting into Scrum, but even bringing in the product first mindset as well, because that's
Yeah.
why they brought me into a lot of these companies to do as well. And I would love your experience in terms of how you have been able to explain these sort of points and perspectives to senior leadership or to just the leadership in general. Because I think the way that I've been actually doing it is say, this is what you guys do. This is what
Yeah.
it needs to do. This is what it needs to do. And this is how you can go there. And it just has not been working.
Yeah, you're talking to someone who spent decades making mistakes at this. So I'm a serial mistake maker. Yeah, so it can get better at this though. First of all, very, very relatable, what you described. I think that the thing that the realization I came to was that I had a deep rooted need as a human to believe that if you could just see how things are, people would somehow magically align around the new way for
Yep.
whatever reason. And I actually think that that was rooted in childhood things, actually, for me. The need that if we could just work it out, if we could just talk it out, if we could just see reality, then we could, because we all loved each other, we would somehow figure it out. And it's difficult to say. It's very heavy to talk about this. But I realized for a long time that there was this sort of, I never even understood, people use this word epistemic honesty or whatever. I can never figure it out, but I'm going to just translate it in my way. Like there's this need or feeling that if we could just, if we could just align on our words or see it. I used to be this about visualized work. If we could just visualize the work, somehow the leaders are going to go in there and they're going to see, my God, all those bottlenecks, like we should be using X or Y or costs of delay or this or these things. And I realized that was my own need that I was putting on the table. And that was a need that for this particular level of kind of a particular way of approaching the problem. And realistically, when you visualize the work, what are you going to do? It's threatening. You're threatening middle management. You are threatening the frontline employees, especially in the layoff climate right now. No one will escalate anything. People are smart. You're not going to escalate that your team's spending 75% of your time doing reactive work, because then someone's going to be like, well, why should we have a team doing 75% reactive work? That's insane. They're not doing value added work. It's like, well, these is how your systems stay up. And it's like, no, No, actually, we're holding the whole thing up. Like we're holding this whole thing up. So I think I'll tell you about my personal path to thinking about this is that you have to meet the organization where it's at. And you need to make these experiments way, 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 way safer than even your most safe normal experiment. To give you an example, I used to be like, well, what could go wrong? We're just going to visualize the work. CTO the next day is tearing down the stickies. They're like, we do not work this way here. The teams work it out themselves. We do not view work across the teams. This is why we've invested a lot of money and time in making sure that the teams can be independent and empowered. This board represents central control for the teams. We do not do that here. Tearing down stickies. This is my own personal career, right? So when it comes to the experiments to do it and meeting the organization where it's at, it's a little bit like, you know what the safest experiment is going out to coffee with someone and just asking the tiniest question, like, what would it actually look like if things were improving here? Like, what would we observe? And then just be quiet for the rest of the coffee chat. That's an experiment, right? To be able to learn that. So we could talk about change all day and then do these things, but that's where I've come to in my mind. Like, you have to meet the company where it's at. They need to discover these things. We can't push them across the gap ourselves. They need to be the ones who are crossing the gap. And Jay Bloom has this gap thinking, present thinking idea. I've done some visuals. I remember doing a visual for it. But, you know, present thinking is about being, the comparison is as follows. Gap thinking, current condition, we will see reality. We will say what we want the future position to be like, and we will figure out what we need to do to get across it, and we will do it. And present thinking is an ideal current condition and working within the organization and kind of moving it up in terms of level of improvement. What I realized is that my heart thought it was in the present thinking thing, but I was still gap thinking. I was still like, oh, we'll visualize the work and then we'll somehow get to the other side of doing it. So yeah, long topic, but I think that that's where I came to personally in this in that journey. To do this thing. So I'm always happy to connect one-on-one too, if it would help to chat one-on-one with someone about it.
I appreciate it. Thank you so much.
Yeah. If things were improving here, what would we observe? Yep. It's a great question because you'll hear things like, there's a wonderful book called Talk to the Elephant. I recommend every Scrum Master read it. It's by someone named Julie Dirksen. It's one of the best books about change that I've read in years because it's so practical. And Julie Dirksen's a behavior design specialist. And her thing is thinking about how behavior changes. And she really challenged me. I did a one-on-one call with her. And then we were chatting about it. And we were talking about like in words like empowered or self-organizing, or the team will, like you read even through the Scrum guide, you're reading this, like some of it's like so specific, like you will do this, but other of it's like so high level. And it really helps if you think about like, what would we observe? The reason why that's a good change question, Maha, is you'll meet these leaders. They're like, oh, I want everyone to be empowered. I want us to be more product led. I want us to be doing things. And then you ask them like, what behaviors would we observe? And they've never done it before. So they can't describe one behavior. They've never seen it. So they can't describe one behavior in sufficient detail to imagine what that future would be like. So it's a really, really good, safe experiment if you just listen when they answer that question. Yeah. Sorry, this got heavy so fast. Any other questions? We've got into change and things like that. Oh yeah, hands. Leo. And then
So,
Karen,
you
were you
know,
about to start with a question? I saw you come off of mute, but you didn't raise your hand. I didn't know
no,
whether.
no, not at all. So
Oh,
I think
okay.
what I'm understanding what you're saying here is don't be threatening. Is that the message that we should be getting from
Oh,
this?
about that. Yeah. I mean, we got into the thing of change. Yeah, I think we probably shift back the conversation to the designing the operating system, because I think there's overlaps with this particular thing. But back to that thing, yeah, or maybe be aware of the ways you might be threatening, or be aware of the ways that your actions might be threatening, and be aware of the degree to which you might think you have people's support, but you might not really know what the common ground is on that particular thing. So yeah, just going back to this concept of change and things, I think as it relates to this question of, as you design out these things, the important point is, if you arrive at an organization, suspend the need to try to document and lean into the idea of observing behaviors. What do the behaviors really say about how this company operates? Who actually set the norms for how the company operates?
Mhm.
You'll see the written document and the real behavior, and you have to kind of lean into that thing. But if you're arriving in an organization and you want to help kind of clarify the design of how you're working, it definitely doesn't help to arrive with a design and drop it on anyone's desk. And it doesn't help
Right.
to I guess where Maha inspired me along that whole line is, it also may not help to say, see, I'm sharing with you all of the ways that you work. Now I'm sharing with you the reality of you're doing it. That may also be threatening. That's how we got down that road on this topic. But does that help a little bit, Leo?
Yeah. So if you go back to that slide that you had showing the two models, I had a
Oh,
follow-up question.
the gap thinking and present
Yeah.
thinking.
Yeah.
Yeah, sure. Oh, yeah, that's I want to make sure that that's Jabe's thing. Hold on one second, because now I've lost. Zoom does this sometimes where I've lost the controls.
Okay.
Where are you all? You're here. Okay. Okay, we'll go back to that slide. Here we go. Sorry, I just found the Google image of the slide.
Right.
Yeah, go ahead.
So you're saying, gap thinking is going to freak everybody out. They're not going to go with this, even though we would love for them to go with this. And then
Yeah.
you say, well, let's focus on present thinking. But if you look in present thinking, there's that middle part,
Yeah.
right? How do you know how
That's a
far you've
great
gone?
yeah. A slight clarification. We're all suckers for gap thinking. We're suckers
Right.
for gap thinking in our personal lives, with our diets, with what we want to do, with our vision quests. Like, we're all suckers for gap thinking. Present thinking is what freaks people out a little bit, right? Because you actually have to be in the moment. You have to be in the present. And I think that the idea that Jabe was trying to get at there is, it's not like in present thinking, you don't have a kind of direction, an aspirational direction of where you're going. It's that you're really grounded in the present, the behaviors of the present. Are you moving forward things in the particular present? So this is a big kind of meme in Big Bang digital transformation and this type of world, right? Which is, the McKinseys of the world come in and gap thinking can be sold all day. I've worked at software vendors that we sold gap thinking all day. That's what you sell. Value selling is gap thinking about those things. And so the reality, I think, in an organization is that the present thinking is very threatening, because you have to lean into a little bit the current reality, which is a kind of difficult to do these things. So I think that the trick to present thinking is, you do need some kind of direction. I think humans do like that sort of inspirational, directional North Star. They like to know that things will get better. However, they also need to be in the present. So those little liminal states, I think, are the moments where you solidify the change. It goes from something that takes a lot of cognitive load and a lot of effort to something that becomes more natural for the team. And so I think that we could imagine almost like a little change curve in there between the current conditions, where you settle in the current condition. To give people a real world example of this, one of our customers, really, this is a great example. Everyone in the company wanted to be more data informed, data driven, and outcome oriented. Everyone. You talk to anyone, who's going to say they don't want to be like that? We'd love to be like that. Yet they spent quarters and quarters trying to find the perfect metrics, trying to find the perfect thing. So finally, the CPO said, and this is a great combination of the present thinking, gap thinking, said, look, our aspiration is to really wow our customers and delight our customers and have a sustainable business here. That's our aspiration. And a path to that is we believe to become more data aware and data informed and outcome oriented. However, it's something that takes practice. It is a skill. It's knowledge times practice equals skill, right? And so what they communicated to the team is like, you know what? You have my permission the next 2 weeks, the next sprint. Your only goal, sprint goal, is to get 5 metrics. I don't care what metrics they are. Put in the data warehouse, put the query to find the data here where everyone can see it. And I want you to commit as a team to spend at least 30 to 60 minutes having a conversation about the metrics that you've selected and talk about, do you have high confidence about it? Does it measure what you think it's measuring? Is it actionable? Can your team influence it in the next month or the next 2 weeks, whatever? You could think about incorporating this into your Scrum Master practice, right? This is kind of a good skill. But the CPO's messaging was so important. They said, this is a skill. We're not going to get it right after 2 weeks. We're not going to get it right, but I need you to commit. I'm committing as a leader to support this effort for the minimum the next 6 months. That's going to be approximately 14 meetings for each of you, however many it is, 16 meetings, 16 sprints. We'll have a retrospective at that time as an organization to see how it's going. We're not going to do comp based on this. This is not some evil empire layoff type thing. We're going to do this together. And they made a great case for it and why it made a case. So that's an interesting example, right? Because it's present thinking mixed with the aspiration and explaining the why. And it's a commitment to the ritual. It's a commitment to the bit. And they're doing great now. Example of why this is important. How many companies say they're going to do OKRs? Everyone's just slapping OKRs on whatever they were doing every quarter anyway. It's all project-based anyway. Yay, we're doing OKRs. Just have milestones if you're going to do that. Don't even go, why are you doing all this other work? You know, this is insanity. And then they stop after 3 quarters because they're saying, well, OKRs don't work. It takes like 3 years to get good at setting goals and understanding what the data even means, right? So you're not going to learn that in 1 quarter to do it. So this is, maybe it answers your question the long way in discussing organizational design, designing your operating system, how to set these aspirational goals in the present, how to support that as a leader. And then when we're talking about operating system design, committing to the ritual over time. And you know what? After 6 months or 8 months, maybe teams are getting good at this. You can drop the ritual. Are we retiring the rituals as we work through? So that's an example of like a real world example from the last month that I learned about. Sorry, a coffee just kicked in, so there's
Did
a
I
lot
see
of.
your hand up at one point?
Yeah, there's some other folks. There was, I think Karen. Yeah.
Okay, my original question was about the example you gave about the executive who said, oh, this board represents centralized control. We don't do that here. And my thought is, did the board represent centralized control or a way to see the full picture? So,
Yeah.
and before you go, if you could summarize, I still don't really
Yep.
get the present gap. Just your concept here is very important. If you could just summarize it before.
Yeah. Well, let's get into the gap in present thinking as the degree to which I understand it. And certainly, I think we could all interpret that in different ways. But I imagine it more as a spectrum. We all have those friends that are all talking about some far off future state. And it's so compelling, but they're not in reality in the present. You know, they're just saying, oh, it's going to be so amazing. I'm going to buy a house on Santorini. I'm just so excited about it. This is the plan. It's going to be amazing. It's going to be great. And then you ask them like, what's going on now to get there, right? Um,
seems that you only have a background of that.
yeah. So, oh no,
That's
that's
not
really
getting
funny.
you a lot closer.
Oh, that's funny. Yeah, it's sad too. My mother's Greek, and so she's getting older, so she just had to sell her house in Greece. So there's a personal element to it as well. But there is an element. So imagine that on one end of the spectrum, right? And then I would say that there's probably people. I use this. I've into this thing called think big, work small. So if you imagine a 2x2, think small, think big, and on the other side, work small, work big. Let's go through the companies. There are companies that think small, work big. That's the worst possible company because they have no strategy and it takes them years to deliver anything. You get the next one, which is think big, work big. And those are the companies that actually have a strategy and think about a potential future that they want to go, but they just learn too slowly. It's like the Titanic, can't move past the iceberg. The Titanic was big thinking, but Titanic is a perfect example of think big, work big in that particular setting. And then you have think small, work small. That to me classifies a lot of companies that are highly agile, but have yet to embrace product-centric thinking or thinking about product strategy or thinking about sustainable businesses. They've actually become incredibly good at working small, but they're iterating in circles. They're just running themselves in circles. And then you have think big, work small. And that to me is this idea of like that's the best balance of that present thinking and gap thinking. That's kind of where we want to go. In Brent Feiberg's book, How Big Things Get Done, he has wonderful examples where he covers mega projects. And he has this example of like the difference between sort of aspiration and then the ability to that mix of big thinking and small working is really brought to life in that book on a mega project scale, like building airports and things like that. It's very, very exciting. So anyway, I think that's probably the best way. I know I've introduced another model, but if you go back into pure gap thinking is think big, work big. Pure present thinking is think small, work small. And we actually kind of want something kind of in the middle there, which is think big, work small, which is maybe an idealized form of present thinking.
And to summarize, how do you get companies to that point is give them more time.
No, it's an interesting thing. I'd be curious to ask people what they think, because I've been surveying people on this for a little bit. Is it easier to take a company that thinks small, work small, to think big, work small, than to take a company that thinks big, works big, to think big, work small? What do people think from your experience? So a company that's great at strategy, just it takes forever to get anything done, is it easier to teach them how to work small? Or is it easier to teach how a company that's figured out how to work really small to embrace product strategy, embrace strategy as a company, holistic thinking across the company? What do you all think?
I think even just working with developers, it's very hard for developers who think big, work big, to get them to work in smaller chunks. It's the hard,
Yeah.
like, it's almost nearly impossible. They almost need to work with someone who's
Yeah.
an ex-developer who they can watch it happen before they believe it. I can't get them to work in smaller chunks. It's nearly impossible. So I can only imagine that scales up.
Oh, that's a great, yeah, Brad, that's a wonderful point there where maybe this is an individual thing, but I've seen developers who suffer from that affliction be very strategic. You know what I mean? Like they're very strategic about their company. So yeah, that's one example where it's not for lack of being able to think the big, but that is their particular challenge, is that they're in that work big, think big development style. It can be difficult to do it. Yeah.
How
Leo.
are they really great at strategy if it's not a strategy that lets them execute? You said great at strategy, but it takes forever to execute. So if they were really great at strategy, they would have a strategy that was executable.
Well, this is the funny thing. If you've looked on LinkedIn, a lot of agile folks and product folks have seemingly I don't know what's happened in the last year, 2 or 3, become obsessed with strategy. They're putting these Wardley maps up there. They're talking about all these books about strategy, about blue ocean strategy and all these things. And I've been looking at that and thinking like, oh, this is great. They've solved these other problems. Now they're getting good at strategy. Or are they justing like we all just? Like if we could just have a great strategy, my company would be worked out to do it. So what I think is funny is that, Karen, to your point, who was it? I'm forgetting their name. One of these great strategy book writers just makes that point. Like if you're not taking into account your and this goes back to your operating system. If you're not taking into account your capabilities as a company, if you're not taking around your operational capabilities, it's not a strategy. So I think that that's the think big part. Like that, I love that point, which is, could you really be thinking big if you're not taking into account your operational capabilities? Interesting point. It also means that there's the big thinkers in your company and then the work biggers in your company. Maybe they're not talking together. Maybe they don't actually realize what the problem is as they're talking. Leo.
You know, thinking about thinking big, thinking small, working small, where do you think budget comes into that conversation? Do you
Oh,
think it's
yeah.
budget that is incentivizing, oh, we gotta think really big or else we're not gonna get this going because whatever reason?
Yeah, I love that. And while we're doing it, Jason Yip, who may have spoken at this, he made the nice diagram for me. I'll just paste the link to the Think Big, Work Small post that he wrote about it. I love that question because it gets into philosophies about funding. I mean, the product that I work on, sort of one of our goals is to allow, our basic theory is that you have concurrent operating models or operating systems, even if you like it or not. So if you're a very rapid growth tech company, some amount of your work will be large project work. In other words, you have to almost lean into it. There are some things that are big and that take many teams. And whether you like it or not, like you can try to make it small in between, and you could wish that you had the idealized org structure, but it's not, you can't just turn the key in it. You could think of SAFE in that way is institutionalized incoherence. I mean, when you have an organization that has 2,000 people in it, and the only way they can get anything done is if 2,000 people collaborate on something, you yourself would invent SAFE. I don't know anyone who's actually proved me otherwise, right? Like you might call it differently and you might actually invent something that you could stop using it, which would be like a nice feature, but you would self-invent SAFE. And I know that because Martin Burns, who died, unfortunately, he became a SAFE practitioner. He's like, John, I'm going to tell you something. I was in the lean portfolio management stuff. We were doing all the organically designed operating systems for years. I was totally into it. We ended up something close to SAFE anyway after 2,000 people. And it's much easier to talk to the executives about it if you have an answer to every question. I was tired of saying like, well, it depends. I needed to just get on with the conversation. Anyway, to that point, we realized at .work that you're going to always run these concurrent operating systems. And so I think that one, you think about that is different shapes of work require different budgeting. If you have to get 500 people working on the same thing, you're going to budget it like a project. There's just nothing you can do. And in fact, I'm going to give you, could you pause the recording for a second? Is it possible to pause the recording? The problem is that the company believes that they can have only one model of funding. So if they are, for example, a 50% big messy project house, and they've always done project portfolio management, they decide that everything has to be funded that way. And if they're a super rapid scale up tech startup that only have 90% independent value stream work, they commit to funding it only as independent value streams or independent work. So that's what I would prompt you to think about, is that the work shapes define the funding models. And then when you think about your operating system, can you absorb concurrent funding models in how you work? And work big just requires a certain type of funding, unfortunately. A lot of words I just said. Sorry, I just had this coffee thing. So
Yeah, I mean, that's the last part is interesting, right? Because the way you play the game when you have the big messy project is, as you showed, quite different,
yeah.
right? So is this a question for leadership to maybe look ahead or look at themselves and say, look, we're not going to stretch ourselves trying to play different games. We're going to focus on this type of game here where we're good at, and we're just going to stick to that.
Oh, I think the question, and this goes a lot to what Karen was talking about. Ways of working and your operating system, you can't have a strategy without thinking about it. So I love your question, right? Because it's sort of like, and to give you an example, let's say that you're at a company that wants to change that. So let's say you're at a company that realizes, this is actually gap thinking, present thinking explained. So Leo, you'll like it. It says that, like, let's say that right now, 50% or more of your work is either technical program managed or multi-team projects. 50% of your capacity, your money roughly is about 50%. And then half of the smaller half, 47% or 45%, are product teams, like legitimate product independent teams, and then early product market fit teams. This is the funny thing to me about Scrum in general. It's like, even in the fastest growing tech companies, only 70% of the teams or 70% of your capacity could meet the definitions of self-organization and having independent things. It's just not. There's no company that has 100% product teams. None. And so if you think about this, it's like, so in this setting, it's some vision for the future, right? They know that to operate more effectively, they want to tilt the odds. To tilt the odds, there's only one way to do it. You have to shift some of the project work to platforms, enabling teams, convert them to product teams. You'll never get rid of the TPM managed projects because 5% or between 5% and 20% of even the highest performing product companies in the world are high dependency projects. And so when you consider this at this moment, then the question as a company is like, do we want to commit to this? Is this what a lot of people talk about transformation, and you ask them how many of your teams actually qualify as healthy, value stream focused product teams, they'll say, I don't know. Well, how are you doing a transformation if you don't know the single most important frickin' metric that exists about the transformation that you're doing? And they don't know. So the question then is, I forget how we got on this, but it would just be like, yes, if you want to transform this way, you have to commit to the bit. You have to commit to this shift over time. And then the question is how are you going to do that? Is it about architecture? Is it about organizational structure? Is it about skills? What do you need to do in the present to gradually shift your way across this chart if it's strategically important? If not, I think there's plenty of companies, frankly, have not committed in any way to agility, even though if they say that from the thing. They've literally thought that, yeah.
The question is a lead up to how do we get to agile, right? Because you have this big company doing big things. All of a sudden they want to be really fast and they don't know how to do fast.
Well, that's seen agile
and then
as a
somebody comes, somebody comes, I read a book.
Yeah.
I read a book. There's this thing called agile. Let's do that. Maybe that's how we get fast. And that's how we come to this point.
Yeah. Well, the thing is, if you see agile as the gap thinking destination, you'll never you'll be caught in the valley of despair all the time. But if you apply agility to agility, you'll take a more present thinking approach and you'll figure out, it's funny. I always, one of the famous sort of drawings that I've done that people like is this journey to product teams drawing that I wrote a long time ago. People share it a lot. And it shows this kind of journey, and it's basically, so every gray arrow is an external handoff. Every pink arrow is an internal handoff within the team. And this is almost like the last 50 years. This is a story of the last 50 years, right? At first, everything had external handoffs. That's my only definition of waterfall in this whole drawing. Next, there was agile with release silos. So the internal handoff was between build and test, and that was called agile with release silos. Next line down, agile, able to release. There was an internal feedback loop between build and test, but you still had to, there was someone who would release it in your team, but you still hand it off to them, right? Oh, okay. Design as a team member. Suddenly during the mid 2000s, everything was about design. Okay, so, oh, we have a designer on our team, but guess what? They just did the mocks and handed it off to the team members. Great. Then you had DevOps. It's going to be great. We're going to run this stuff ourselves. But it was still an internal handoff to the person on the team who was 20% time on keeping the systems up. Okay. And then you have the feature factory teams, which are like, oh, requirements planning happens within the teams, but literally someone is handing off the requirements to design, build, test, release, and run. And then you have these product teams with a mini CEO. You have a product manager who dictates to the teams what problem they're going to do, and then you get it. And then you have product teams, which in theory is this one at the bottom. The reason why I share it though is I could just keep making that diagram go more and more rows. Then you have agility expanding more to the organization. The next year you're going to have more. You'll have platform teams and enabling teams, which are a really important component. Then you'll have to think about architecture at scale. Then you're going to have to, there's 10 more of those boxes down below as you go through. So that's sort of talking about the journey aspect of it, I think is important.
All right, well, we have about 6 minutes left. So is there a sort of a short, quick question someone wants to squeeze in here?
Tori did ask a question. What advice do you have or would you offer for organizations that attempt to jump on the Agile bandwagon without any sort of alignment and clarity of how their product function will function? What I often find is many orgs go down the road of making the grand gestures and process management with an R&Rs. Great point. That's about our operating system. Any advice would you give leaders on where to start? How to create project-centric things? My current take on that is to just focus on behaviors. Like, what behaviors would we observe if we were moving along our product-centric journey? I'll give you one. Engineers would have direct contact with customers from out in the world at a minimum of once every 2 weeks. That's a behavior. That is a behavior I've observed in companies that are good at product, right? Like, it's a basic behavior. And what would you need to do to try to encourage that behavior? And what leadership support would you need to scaffold that? And this is a really important concept to this whole problem, which is if a CTO said, now the new policy is that every developer will now spend a minimum of one time talking to customers every 2 weeks, and you will be graded on it, and that's your performance review or whatever. Never going to work. I mean, it will work. People will go through the motions, but it won't be real to do the thing. But if the leader says, this is why we're doing it, this is the direction we're taking, I'd like to run a 6-month experiment. After that, we can reconsider this. We're going through the motions now because it's a new muscle for us, but in the future, maybe it will just become the way we work and how we're doing it. I'm going to be on the calls myself. You may see me drop in on your calls because I have to be on the phone with a real world customer once every 2 weeks at a minimum. World of difference. And so to Tori, to your particular thing, it seems so simple, but I would try to get the organization focused on behaviors. How often do we have a product manager, designer, and tech lead or engineering lead in a meeting digging into the problem and discussing that primarily versus talking about what the team's going to be delivering in the next week or two? How do we create conditions where we could have more of that to do that? So that's how I would answer it. It seems simple, but it's very hard.
And who does that have to come from?
Well, if you do not have the leader who will say what I just said, it's going to fail. Mm-hmm. Middle out change fails. Bottom up change fails. Top down change fails. The only change that works is top down, bottom up.
And the leader, the ideal leader is?
CPO, SVP of blank. And here's the thing though, everyone's like, oh, we're never going to get the person to say that. I have discovered it's actually a lot easier to get them to say that than we think. You need to socially engineer them a little bit and you need to guide them down this path. But to run one small experiment where they do some kind of messaging like that and everyone sort of commits to the bit for a little bit, and goes through the motions, it's actually easier than you think when you don't talk about agility or product stuff or whatever. It's exactly like, hi, I'm so happy. I know we have one chance a quarter to chat. I've been thinking about the teams, and I've been thinking about, like, what would we observe if we were moving along the journey that we keep talking about? I'm not talking about frameworks. I'm not talking about, are we doing Scrum? Are we doing anything perfect? I'm just like, what would we observe? There's this one thing that I have to be honest, I haven't observed in the last month, 2 or 3. And that's an engineer on a team or on teams actually connecting with end customers. What would you think if of course, we have to subtract something to add something, because you don't want to just do additive change. If you just add more shit that people need to do, then you're just making their life difficult. So you have to subtract something, like, oh, we're not going to do the third stand-up of the week when people are saying the same stuff over and over again. It's really a waste of time. We're going to dedicate that to customer listening time every Wednesday morning. How about that? Why don't we do it with a sample team or set of teams, but I want to keep you in the loop about what we're doing, and then run that experiment to do it. So my point being, there's probably people who are way better at persuasion than I am, but I've even had luck with that, that bit. Like, it's not about frameworks or whatever. It's just about behaviors. It's about creating the conditions where then they can do that messaging to give the leader support for it, to be able to do it.
That brings the CPO to present moment.
Right. Present moment, present behaviors, what's actually happening to do these things. And one thing, as a caveat to that, watch out for the forever problems. Like, retrospective follow-ups. I've been talking about this so long, it just makes my head explode. People will be like, well, we don't follow up on the action items from the retrospective. If you wade into the behaviors that have been problems forever, you're up against a huge hurdle, right? So if you went to the CPO and said, you know what, people talk about retrospectives and then they think about action items, but I don't think that they follow up on their action items, and following up on the action items is exactly what they need to do, like per, statute 11.72 of the Scrum guide. So why don't we have to implement that. We have to enforce that. Not going to work. You can just tell it's not going to work. None of my spidey sense says that will ever work, because it's like, it's been a forever problem, and it's a human problem, and we're not good at that in our personal lives. If you can't do it yourself in your personal life outside of work, you're not going to do it at work with 5 people on a team, and you're certainly not going to do it with 700 people to do it. So I think that, like, some of these other things are easier to commit to the thing, like, oh, we're going to be on the call with customers, or we're going to do something like that. So pick the right bets, I think, is important.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, John. This has been really great. I wish we had like 3 more hours of this or more. We can.
Well, hopefully, yeah. I mean, you caught
Really
me. I'm
great.
pretty excited about this stuff, but there's this operating system. Thanks for, if anyone ever wants to chat more about this. I know we did this on semi-short notice.
Yeah, I mean, why don't we set up
Yeah.
another time, maybe next month, if you're
Yeah.
interested. John, I'm putting you on the spot here, but since you kind of offered, why don't you and I talk offline, and we'll get something on the calendar for next month?
Yeah, we need to do our change agent boot camp to keep ourselves sane and
Yeah, I think this would
stop
be.
making the same mistakes over and over and over again. Like, and maybe hearing it from other folks, how some of these are mistakes that we still continue to make over and over again.
Fantastic.
That would be helpful for folks to do it.
For sure, for sure. So let's do that, and everybody keep an eye out. You'll be hearing from us, and we'll get something set up. And John,
Cool.
many thanks, sincere
Yeah.
thank you for your time and your knowledge, and being with us here today, and even on short notice. I appreciate it, and I know
Sure thing.
everybody
Yeah,
else.
go out there and everyone have that conversation with a senior leader at the company, but just pick the right
I love
the
it.
right
I
bit.
have so many
to do.
little things.
Cool.
The goal.
Alrighty.
So thanks, John.
Talk to you soon.
Everyone else,
Great.
have a great rest of your day. And we'll see you next time.